The smell of grilled meat always reminded me of Sundays at my parents' place. Routine, sunlit, predictable. But that evening, standing at the window in a thin cotton dress, barefoot on the cold tiles of the kitchen floor, I felt something shift. My husband's laughter echoed from the backyard, deep and hearty, blending with the sound of the tongs clanking against the grill. His best friend was with him, bottle of red wine in one hand, that familiar, crooked grin stretched across his face. They were comfortable, like two old books left open next to each other for years. And I was the coffee stain in between them. I leaned on the counter, letting the glass of chilled rosé slip between my fingers. I had chosen it deliberately, not because I liked the taste, but because it made me feel like someone who made elegant decisions. I had spent an extra 5 minutes in front of the mirror before they came, picking a dress that fell just off my shoulder and brushing my hair until it fell in loose waves. I even wore the lace set I had bought weeks ago and never dared put on. Just in case. A foolish notion, maybe. Or not. When I stepped out with the salad bowl, the air was thick with wood smoke and male voices. My husband reached for me automatically, pressing a quick kiss to my cheek, his fingers still sticky from the marinade. I smiled, because that's what wives do. They smile when their husband kisses them at the right time, in front of the right people. But my eyes met his friend's for a brief second, and in that second there was no smoke, no grill, no husband. Just him. And me. He was always too observant, too present in a way that made me want to look away. But I didn't. Not this time. His gaze didn't drop, didn't wander. It held mine with quiet certainty, like someone remembering a moment no one else had noticed. I turned away, laughed at something I hadn't quite heard, and forced myself to move naturally. Hips steady, shoulders loose like I didn't notice the heat rushing to my neck. Dinner unfolded like it always did. Meat perfectly grilled, wine flowing easily, inside jokes flying across the table. My husband talked about work, a promotion rumor that had circled the office, the neighbor's new dog. He was relaxed. In his mind, everything was in place. Food, friendship, love. He was a man proud of his home and of the people who filled it, but I felt like a guest. Later, when the plates were cleared and the laughter dimmed to soft conversation, I found myself standing in the kitchen again, rinsing glasses under warm water. I didn't hear him come in, just felt his presence, quiet but unmistakable. He stood behind me, too close, the kind of close you don't acknowledge if you want to keep things simple. Need a hand? His voice was low, like the last string of a guitar still humming after a chord is played. I handed him a towel without turning. "You never help?" I said, keeping it light. He chuckled. "Maybe I never noticed you needed help." There was a pause, and I felt it. The pulse in my neck, loud and unreasonable. His hand brushed against mine as he took a glass. A touch that could have meant nothing, and yet my breath caught. I rinsed another glass, stared at the water spiraling down the drain. "You look different," he said suddenly. I glanced at him. "Different how?" "I don't know." He folded the towel slowly. "Just not like before." I wanted to ask before what, but the words stuck somewhere between caution and curiosity. Instead, I turned off the tap and dried my hands, careful to avoid looking at him. Outside, my husband called out something unintelligible, his voice cutting through the stillness. His friend smiled. "Duty calls." He walked away first. No drama, no lingering, no unnecessary wait. But just before stepping out, he stopped and touched my arm. Light, fleeting, but deliberate. I froze. His thumb pressed softly against the inside of my wrist, where the skin was thin and the blood ran close to the surface. Then he was gone. I stood there, hands still in midair, heartbeat loud in the hush of the kitchen. The glass on the counter was half full. My reflection in the window, shoulders bare, hair slightly mussed, cheeks flushed, looked back at me with a question I couldn't yet answer. The rest of the evening passed in familiar movements. Cleaning up, locking doors, brushing teeth next to my husband in silence. Slipping into bed, Our backs facing opposite directions, a shared mattress that felt strangely wide. But I didn't sleep. I lay awake with the memory of a thumb against my wrist and a gaze that didn't ask permission. And I knew, not in a romantic, cinematic way, but in the aching clarity of real life, that something had started. Not a story. Not a game. Something far less predictable. The house was quieter than usual. My husband had fallen asleep in front of the television, a documentary still murmuring into the darkened living room. The glass of wine I poured myself remained untouched on the coffee table, already sweating, forgotten like the promises couples make to keep dating each other even after the wedding. I sat on the edge of the sofa, elbows on knees, staring at nothing, waiting for something I hadn't admitted even to myself. Then the doorbell rang. Not loud, not urgent, just one chime, deliberate and soft. I knew before I opened it who it was. That knowledge lived low in my belly, a slow, rolling certainty that had nothing to do with logic. I didn't hesitate. My hand reached for the doorknob as if guided by muscle memory I didn't know I had. He stood there in the porch light, holding a coat he hadn't taken with him earlier. "You forgot this," I said before he could. "Apparently." There was a pause, not awkward but steeped in something unspoken. His eyes didn't leave mine. I stepped aside and let him in. He brushed past me, and the scent of him, wood smoke, something earthy and warm, hit me like a memory I hadn't made yet. The door clicked shut behind him. I didn't lock it. He placed the coat on the back of the chair and turned to face me. No one said anything. Words would have diluted the weight of the moment. I could have picked it up another day. He finally said, voice quiet but steady. "I know. Why didn't you stop me earlier?" His gaze was sharp but not accusing. "Because I didn't want to," I answered without thinking. The truth hung in the air, unembellished, bare. He took a step closer, his eyes scanning my face like he was looking for signs of resistance. There was none. I stood still, letting the silence stretch, my breath measured but shallow. The space between us shrank not by movement but by momentum. Something inevitable was pulling us forward. And then he kissed me. No hesitation, no request, just the sure weight of his mouth against mine, and the soft, sudden exhale I didn't know I was holding. His hands found my waist, fingers firm but not possessive. My own hands, traitorous or brave, slid up his chest, feeling the shape of his body beneath the thin cotton of his shirt. The kiss wasn't sweet. It wasn't clumsy either. It was precise, like punctuation after a sentence we'd both been afraid to finish. I felt the lace beneath my dress press against my skin as I leaned into him. The coolness of the kitchen tiles under my feet, the warmth of his palm at the small of my back. Time didn't stop. It just moved differently. Heavier, more intentional. Then I pulled away. Not dramatically, not with guilt, just enough to look at him. "I can't," I began, not knowing what came next. "You already did," he said softly, brushing a loose strand of hair from my cheek. A pause. No one moved. Then I turned away, stepped back toward the sink. The wine glass from earlier still sat there, the one I hadn't touched. I picked it up, stared into the pale pink swirl at the bottom. "I need to clean up." "Of course," he replied, and I couldn't tell if it was irony or respect that colored his voice. He walked to the door and before opening it, looked back. "You're not what I expected." I met his eyes. "Neither are you." The door closed behind him. No slam, no finality. Just the soft sound of something unfinished. I stood there, glass still in hand, the faint taste of him lingering on my lips like a question. Upstairs, I could hear my husband snoring lightly. That familiar, steady rhythm that had once comforted me. I climbed the stairs slowly, body buzzing with contradiction. In the bedroom, I undressed without ceremony, folding my dress over the chair, unclasping my bra with careful fingers. I didn't slip into pajamas. I left the lace on, not out of defiance, out of curiosity. It was the first time in years I'd worn it and felt something because of it. I slid under the sheets, careful not to wake him. His arm shifted in sleep, falling loosely across my waist. A gesture of habit, not desire. I lay still, listening to the rise and fall of his breath. My own heart beat too fast. Not from shame, not even from excitement, but from recognition of a woman I thought I'd lost somewhere between mortgage payments and Sunday grocery runs. I closed my eyes and saw his hand reaching for mine in the dim kitchen light. The way he didn't apologize. The way I didn't want him to. Morning would come, as it always did. Coffee would be brewed, the dishwasher would hum, and nothing would look out of place. But something had shifted. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. The morning after was startling in its normalcy. Light filtered in through the blinds just the way it always did, cutting soft strips across the wooden floor and casting quiet patterns on the bedsheets. My husband moved beside me, still half asleep, mumbling something about work and forgetting to set his second alarm. I answered on autopilot, pressing my lips to his shoulder like I had every morning for years, and wondered if he noticed how cold they felt. He got up, walked to the bathroom, scratching the back of his neck, humming under his breath. I watched him through half-lidded eyes, wondering when exactly that distance began growing between us. He was still the same man. Still made my tea exactly the way I liked it. Still brought me lilacs every spring from that crooked bush near the fence. But somewhere in the cracks between routine and repetition, something vital had dried up. Something I hadn't realized I missed until someone else made me feel it again. I didn't speak of the night before. Of course not. There was no place for that kind of truth at the breakfast table, between toast and eggs and talk of traffic on the interstate. He kissed me on the cheek and left, briefcase in hand, without looking twice. The door clicked behind him and I was left in the quiet kitchen, the smell of his cologne still lingering, mixing now with guilt and something more dangerous. Anticipation. I told myself it meant nothing, that it would pass, that it was a fluke, a mistake made in a moment of weakness. I even believed it for a few hours, until I ran into him again. It was late afternoon when I decided to stop by the grocery store. I didn't need anything urgently. Just carrots, some eggs, maybe toothpaste. I wasn't even sure what pulled me there. Only that staying in the house with the silence and the memory of a kiss circling in my mind was starting to feel unbearable. He was by the produce aisle, holding a bag of oranges like it weighed more than it should. I saw him before he saw me, and something inside me fluttered. Fear, maybe. Or excitement pretending to be fear. He turned, caught my gaze, and didn't smile. Just nodded slightly, like we were business acquaintances acknowledging one another in a public space. I walked past him, heart hammering in my chest, pretending to scan avocados, but I felt him behind me before he spoke. "You always shop here on Wednesdays?" His voice was low, closer than I expected. I turned slightly, enough to see the side of his face. I needed a few things. He leaned against the shelf casually, one hand in his pocket. "You look like someone who's trying not to run." I didn't answer. "I meant what I said last night," he continued, watching me. "What part?" I asked, still not meeting his eyes. He stepped closer. "All of it." There was a pause. One of those heavy ones that seems to soak into the air and stay there. I felt the edge of the shelf pressing into my thigh and didn't move. "This isn't a game," I said quietly. "Number, it isn't." His tone was calm, serious. "But we're already playing." I finally looked at him. His expression wasn't smug, wasn't cruel. It was almost careful. Like he knew exactly how far to lean before something tipped. "I can't do this," I whispered. "You already did." I should have walked away then. I should have thrown the carrots in the cart, made an excuse, gone home and washed the moment off like a stain. But instead, I followed him to the parking lot. 2 bags of groceries between us, like a flimsy buffer against everything we weren't saying. His truck door was already open when I said, "Can you drive me home?" He looked at me, something sharp flickering in his eyes. "Are you sure?" I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. We drove in silence for the first few minutes. The radio played something instrumental, soft jazz, barely audible. His hands on the steering wheel were steady, confident. I kept mine folded in my lap, gripping the fabric of my coat too tightly. "I've thought about you," he said finally, not looking my way. "More than I probably should." My voice came out quieter than I expected. "Why?" He shrugged. "Because I've never forgotten how you used to laugh when we were all younger. Because you used to lean forward when you listened, like you wanted to catch every word. Because even back then there was something in your eyes that looked like longing." I turned toward the window. My reflection stared back at me. Older, quieter, dimmed. And yet that word, longing, echoed in my chest like a bell struck softly but deeply. He pulled into my driveway, the truck idling. Neither of us moved. "I miss being touched like someone wants to touch me," I said suddenly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. He didn't speak, but his hand reached out, brushed the back of mine with his fingertips. I didn't flinch. The contact sent a shiver through me, a current of memory and promise. His fingers didn't linger. They just acknowledged. When I stepped out of the truck, he didn't follow. I turned before shutting the door. "This can't happen again," I said. He tilted his head slightly. "Then don't let it." I closed the door. Inside, I put away the groceries with trembling hands, my skin still tingling from that feather-light touch. The house was quiet, the dog asleep in his usual corner. The clock ticked like it always did, but something in me was loud now, too loud to ignore. Later that night, my husband returned with Chinese takeout and a tired smile. We ate in the living room, watching reruns of a show we both liked. At one point, he reached over and ran his hand down my arm, absently, more gesture than affection. I looked at him then, really looked, and wondered if he noticed how little I reacted. When we went to bed, he kissed me on the forehead and turned off the light. His breathing slowed quickly, sleep taking him effortlessly. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Not because I felt guilt, but because, for the first time in years, I felt awake. Tomorrow, I told myself, would be the day I walked away from the edge. But somewhere deep down, I knew I was already too far past it. I told myself I wouldn't answer him again. That I'd let the silence between us grow cold and heavy. Let it press down hard enough to flatten whatever had started to bloom. I spent the morning ironing sheets, watering the plants, polishing the wood on the dining table that no one ever used. Useless gestures meant to imitate control. But by midday, my phone buzzed, and the message he sent was as brief as it was deliberate. "You still have that dress you wore the last time I saw you?" I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. I should have ignored it. I should have deleted it and gone back to folding towels. But instead, I walked upstairs and opened the back of the closet. The dress was still there, that soft gray one, cinched at the waist, modest on the hanger, but somehow bold when I wore it. I remembered his eyes on it, not with hunger, but with the strange reverence of someone who finds something beautiful in the ordinary. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. By 4 in the afternoon, I knew what I was going to do. My husband was working late, caught in endless conference calls and traffic reports. He called around 5 to say he'd probably eat at the office. I heard the clicking of his keyboard in the background as he spoke, his voice kind but distracted. I said all the right things. Told him not to worry, told him I'd see him later. I took my time getting ready, not out of vanity, but with a strange kind of care. I chose lingerie that made me feel seen even when no one else would see it. A dusty plum set with delicate straps and fine lace that had lived in a drawer untouched for months. I slipped it on, the coolness of the fabric a jolt to my skin. The dress followed, falling perfectly along the curve of my back. Then a light touch of perfume, just enough to be noticed up close. I wasn't sure what I was preparing for, an encounter or a confrontation, but I felt like a woman stepping into something irreversible. He picked me up on time. He didn't ask where my husband was. I didn't volunteer the information. We didn't kiss. We didn't touch. We sat in the car, side by side, the tension so thick it felt like another person in the back seat. "Where are we going?" I asked. "You'll see." We drove out of town, away from the rows of matching houses and trimmed hedges, past the open fields and roadside diners. Eventually, he pulled into the parking lot of a small bar overlooking the coast, a faded place with peeling paint and dim orange lights under the awning. It was quiet, almost empty, the kind of place you could disappear in without anyone asking why. Inside, the bartender nodded at him with familiarity. We sat in a booth near the back, away from the windows. The lighting was warm, almost nostalgic, and the music was old. Not vintage enough to be ironic, just sincere. He ordered whiskey. I asked for wine but didn't drink it. We talked, not about us, not about what had happened or what hadn't. We talked about nothing. Old movies, terrible drivers, the absurdity of frozen dinners that claimed to be gourmet. He made me laugh, genuinely. His humor was dry, edged with sarcasm, and laced with something softer that only showed when he wasn't looking directly at me. At some point I asked, "Why now?" He didn't pretend not to understand. He leaned back in the booth, eyes fixed on mine. "Because I've been watching you sit still for years," he said, "and I kept waiting for someone to notice that you were sinking." I looked away, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. "I'm not looking for rescue," I said. "I know," he replied. "You don't need one. You just need someone who sees you." The silence between us after that wasn't empty. It was full of all the things we weren't brave enough to say. I finished my drink and we stepped outside, the sea wind catching my hair as we walked down toward the overlook. The cliff wasn't steep, but it felt high enough to matter. Below, the waves were dark and slow, kissing the rocks with soft persistence. We stood there for a long time, shoulder to shoulder, our arms never touching but close enough that my skin hummed. And then he said it. "I've booked a place, an hour from here." I turned to him, expecting a smirk, a dare, some trace of the man who had always been a little too confident. But there was none of that. Just a quiet offer, a space held open, no pressure. He handed me a small card. On it, the name of a roadside inn, handwritten, and a time, tomorrow, 3 p.m. "You don't have to come," he said, "but I'll be there." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked me back to the car, drove me home in silence. I didn't ask if he'd done this before. I didn't want to know. When he pulled up to the house, he didn't lean in. He didn't reach for me. He just looked straight ahead and said, "Tell me if you're coming. Or don't. I'll know either way." I got out without a word. My legs felt unsteady. My thoughts, worse. Inside, the house was dim. I turned on one light, then another. The normalcy wrapped around me like a too-tight coat. I went upstairs, peeled off the dress, and folded it carefully before placing it back in the closet. Then I lay on the bed in silence, still in the lace lingerie. My skin cooled now, but my body aching with a kind of awareness I couldn't shake. I stared at the ceiling, trying to picture what the next day would look like. Not in fantasy, but in real, measured, impossible clarity. There was no romantic soundtrack in my head. No rush of forbidden thrill. Just one quiet truth I could no longer deny. I wanted to go. Not because he made me feel special, but because when I was with him, I finally remembered who I was before I became invisible. I told myself I wouldn't go. That was the decision I made before I even got out of bed the next morning. I'd drink my coffee slowly, go about my day like I always did. Laundry, emails, maybe a short walk to clear my head. I would be calm, rational, adult. The card he gave me was still on the nightstand, right where I left it. I glanced at it once and then pretended to forget it was there. By 10 a.m., I was vacuuming a perfectly clean carpet. By noon, I'd scrubbed the inside of the fridge, rearranged the pantry, and alphabetized the spice rack. At 1:17 p.m., I found myself in the shower for the second time that day. I stood under the hot stream of water, unmoving, letting it wash over me like it could somehow erase the pull in my chest. But it didn't. My skin felt too sensitive, like it remembered every place he'd looked at, every place he hadn't yet touched. When I stepped out and wrapped myself in a towel, my reflection in the fogged mirror startled me. Not because of how I looked, but because of how aware I suddenly was of my body. My thighs, my neck, the curve of my hips. All parts I'd long since stopped paying attention to. Parts that had become utilitarian, rarely indulged, mostly ignored. And now they felt like mine again, but also like his. I opened the drawer and pulled out the plum lingerie I had worn that night in the bar. I hadn't even tucked it away. It lay there like a question waiting for an answer. By 2:08, I was in the car. The drive was quiet, the road unfamiliar but smooth. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was choosing. There was no justification in my mind. No excuses, no rehearsed lines to soothe myself. I wasn't walking into something I didn't understand. I was walking in with both eyes open. The roadside inn was modest, old but clean. A faded blue sign hung over the entrance, slightly crooked. There were no flowers in the planters, just dry soil. A man in a windbreaker leaned against the vending machine, smoking in silence. I parked and sat for a moment, letting the engine hum beneath me. I checked the time. 2:56. Then I stepped out, legs steadier than I expected. Room 207. He had texted the number that morning. No greeting. No pressure. I walked the hallway slowly. My heels clicked against the tile floor, a sound that made me feel too present, too loud. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Not because I was unsure, but because something inside me wanted to hold on to the moment before a little longer. I knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. He stood there, dressed simply. Dark jeans, button-down shirt rolled at the sleeves. No smile, just eyes that searched my face as if confirming that I was real. "You came," he said, more fact than surprise. I didn't answer. I stepped in. The room was dim, the curtains drawn. A single lamp cast a warm pool of light over the small table by the window. There was a bottle of water, 2 glasses, a bowl of cherries. No wine, no pretense. He closed the door behind me and locked it with a soft click. For a long moment, we stood facing each other. Neither of us moved. The silence wasn't awkward. It was taut, electric, like we both understood we had entered something that didn't have a script. Then he reached for my hand. It was a small gesture. Gentle. He didn't pull, just held it. Palm against palm, like we were both checking for a pulse. "You don't have to stay," he said. But I didn't move. Instead, I let my fingers trace the back of his hand, the small scar near his thumb. I had never noticed it before. It made him real. Human. Not some fantasy conjured in the shadow of my dissatisfaction. I stepped closer. His other hand came up, touching the side of my face, his thumb brushing just beneath my eye. I closed my eyes for a second, just breathing. The moment stretched, then narrowed, until the space between us vanished. When our mouths met, it wasn't tentative like the first time. There was no question in the way he kissed me. Only certainty. Only need. His lips were warm, his hands steady. He kissed like a man who had imagined it too many times and now didn't want to miss a single detail. The second kiss deepened slowly. My body reacted before my mind caught up, leaning into him, fingers curling into the fabric at his back. The lace beneath my dress scratched slightly against my skin, grounding me in every sensation. I was very aware of my breath. The way it hitched when his fingers traced the inside of my wrist. The way it trembled when his mouth found the curve of my jaw. My heart thudded against my ribs, but there was no panic in it. Just heat. Desire. Permission. We didn't speak. Words would have complicated something that, in its silence, made more sense than anything else had in years. And yet, even in the middle of that electricity, I felt a flicker of sadness. Because this was what I'd been missing. Not sex, not attention, but intimacy. The kind that made me feel like I existed outside the roles I played. Wife, hostess, employee, responsible woman in a tidy life. Here, in this room, I was just a woman who wanted. After we lay side by side, fully clothed again, staring at the ceiling. His fingers traced lazy circles on my palm. My breathing had evened out, but something inside me still quivered. Not from guilt, but from the sheer force of having felt alive. He didn't ask me questions. Didn't ask if I would come back. He just turned his head toward me and said, "You deserve to want something." I didn't respond. I didn't have the words. Outside, the sun had begun to lower, casting long shadows through the curtains. I sat up, smoothed my dress, tucked my hair behind my ear. I should go. I know. He stood when I did, walked me to the door without touching me again. But before I stepped out, I looked back. He was watching me, not with hope, not with longing, but with understanding. I nodded once. A thank you, maybe. Or goodbye. Or nothing at all. The drive home was quiet. The radio played some soft piano track I didn't recognize. My phone buzzed once, my husband asking if I wanted takeout. I replied, "Sure, whatever you feel like." When I arrived, the house was lit with the golden hue of early evening. I walked inside, placed my bag on the counter, and washed my hands like I always did. The house looked the same. I looked the same. But nothing inside me was the same anymore. That evening passed in quiet gestures and pre-programmed responses. My husband returned with 2 paper bags of Thai food, kissing my temple absently as he handed me the one labeled mild curry. I thanked him with a smile I'd worn so many times it practically lived on my face. We ate in front of the television, our bodies angled toward the screen but not toward each other. He spoke about a new project at work, how the new intern didn't understand basic file organization. I nodded at the right moments, offered mild reactions. He didn't notice that I barely touched my food. He didn't ask why I was quieter than usual. Maybe he thought I was tired. Maybe he'd long since stopped noticing the difference between my silences, the ones filled with fatigue and the ones filled with fire. After dinner, he cleared the plates while I wiped down the counters, both of us moving with the practiced efficiency of a couple that had shared too many days, too many routines. We were synchronized, a machine of domestic harmony. And yet, with each movement, I felt further from him than I had ever felt before. Not out of cruelty, not even from guilt, but from the unbearable knowledge that I had tasted something real and couldn't pretend I hadn't. When he reached out to brush a crumb from my cheek, I flinched. Just slightly, just enough to notice. He didn't react, but the moment hung in the air longer than it should have. Later, as he scrolled through emails on the couch, I stood in the hallway, watching him from the shadows. My heart wasn't broken. My marriage wasn't crumbling. That was the strangest part of it all. We were still intact, still functional. But something essential was absent, like a scent you don't realize is gone until someone else walks by and smells like memory. He looked up. "Want to watch something?" "Maybe later," I said. "I'm going to lie down for a bit." I went upstairs and changed into soft cotton pajamas. Nothing alluring, nothing chosen. I crawled into bed and stared at the ceiling fan as it rotated slowly above me. I didn't sleep. When he finally came upstairs and slid under the covers beside me, he turned toward me, one arm casually finding my waist. His fingers brushed along my ribcage. An invitation, the kind that had once meant something. I closed my eyes. He kissed my neck, and I felt nothing. Not revulsion, not resistance. Just a cool detachment, like my body had unplugged from the moment. His hand moved slowly, respectfully, trying to find some kind of rhythm we had once known. I let it happen for a few seconds, but my body didn't respond. "Everything okay?" he whispered, not unkindly. I turned to face him in the dark and forced a smile. "Just tired." He kissed my forehead and rolled back onto his side. That was all. No anger, no suspicion, Just sleep." He drifted off within minutes, his breathing steady and deep. I watched him, listening to the sound of it, thinking about how strange it was that someone could be so close to you physically and yet so impossibly far from your inner world. I got up quietly, padded down to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water. As I stood at the window, I saw the faint outline of a car turning the corner, its headlights sweeping briefly across our yard before disappearing down the road. I wondered where it was going, who it was carrying, whether the driver felt that same press of loneliness that sometimes finds you even when you're not alone. I thought of the motel room, the low lamp, the stillness, the way he looked at me like I was a painting he'd once admired and suddenly found again in a dusty attic. That look had nothing to do with ownership. It wasn't about claiming. It was about seeing. And I hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since someone had really seen me. The next day brought no drama, no confrontation, just breakfast, dry toast, emails. Life didn't fall apart. It simply went on, which somehow made it worse. Because I felt like I was splitting into two versions of myself. The one who folded laundry and smiled at neighbors, and the one who remembered the heat of another man's breath against her collarbone. It was during lunch that I got the call. He had left something at our house. Something trivial. A tool he'd lent my husband. He asked if he could stop by. I hesitated. "He's at work." There was a pause. "That's not why I called." I should have said no, but instead I said, "Come after 5. The hours between the call and his arrival passed like molasses. Every sound in the house was too loud. The ticking of the clock, the low hum of the fridge, the creak of the stairs under my feet. I couldn't focus. I couldn't sit still. At 5:03, the doorbell rang. I opened it without checking the peephole. He stood there, holding a small canvas bag with a wrench and some screws clinking inside. His eyes searched mine, cautious but certain. I stepped aside and let him in. He placed the bag on the kitchen counter and turned to face me. "You look different." I crossed my arms. "So do you." Neither of us laughed. The silence stretched again, taut and fragile. "I wasn't sure you'd come that day," he said. "I wasn't sure I would either. But you did." I nodded. "And now we're here." He moved closer, just enough that I could feel his breath. He didn't reach for me this time. He waited. I stepped forward and our hands brushed as naturally as if they had done it 100 times. And maybe, in some way, they had. In dreams, in stolen glances, in the long years of what-ifs that we never allowed ourselves to explore. But we didn't kiss. Not this time. Instead, we stood in the middle of my kitchen, barely touching, breathing the same air. The sun dipped below the horizon outside, casting a warm orange light across the floor. I noticed how it hit his face, softened the sharpness, deepened the shadows. "I think about you more than I should," I whispered, unsure why I said it. He nodded slowly. "Same." And then we heard the car pull into the driveway. My husband. Neither of us panicked. He picked up the bag, nodded once, and walked toward the door. Before he stepped out, he turned to me and said quietly, "You don't have to hide from yourself." Then he was gone. I closed the door behind him just as the front one opened. My husband walked in, smiling, tie loosened, shoulders relaxed. "Smells like coffee. You make a fresh pot?" I nodded, stepping forward to take his briefcase. And as he leaned down to kiss me, I wondered how long I could keep living two lives inside one body. I've often heard that the most dangerous part of any affair isn't the beginning. It's the middle. The part where it stops feeling like a reckless decision and begins to feel like a place you go to breathe. That's where I was. Every day looked the same from the outside. Breakfast together, parting words at the door, chores, calls, routines. The rhythm of a long marriage, a life built from small rituals and shared calendars. But under that polished surface, something else had settled in. A second heartbeat, pulsing just beneath the ordinary. I live by glances, pauses, and unsent messages. I no longer counted days by date or season, but by the last time I had seen him. And then came the supermarket. Of all places, I had only gone for a carton of milk and some bread. The list was short, easily forgettable. I didn't expect to see him there. I didn't expect to feel like the ground tilted when our eyes met near the dairy aisle. We both froze. He stood with a basket of tomatoes and a bottle of wine. I hadn't worn anything deliberate, jeans, a coat, hair pulled back. But his gaze lingered anyway, holding me still like a string had pulled taut between us. He stepped toward me slowly, and for a moment I thought we might speak right there between rows of butter and yogurt. But we didn't. Instead, he whispered, low enough for no one else to hear. "There's a park down the street, behind the church. Meet me there?" I didn't respond. I simply turned and walked away. And 20 minutes later, I found myself sitting on a weather-worn bench, watching winter sunlight scatter through the bare trees, wondering when exactly I had become the kind of woman who met a man in public parks to avoid being seen. He arrived without noise, taking the spot beside me but not too close. His hands were bare, fingers red from the cold. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. I wasn't either. We sat in silence, the wind soft and dry. A family passed nearby. 2 parents, a small child with a red balloon. The kind of scene that would have once made me smile. Now, it just felt distant. Like something from a life I'd already lived and forgotten. "I didn't plan any of this," I said. "You think I did?" Number. But I also didn't stop it. He turned his head toward me. "Are you trying to stop it now?" I wanted to say yes. Wanted to be the woman with conviction, boundaries, clarity. But the truth sat heavy in my throat. "I don't know how," I admitted. There was a quiet between us that felt like mourning. Not for what we had done, but for everything we couldn't change. "I should tell him," I said suddenly, the words sharp in the cold air. "My husband. He deserves to know." He studied me. "Would that be for him or for you?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. He reached for my hand, a brief touch, barely there, and then let go. "Let's get out of here." We walked back to the car in silence. I followed him this time, without asking where we were going. The drive was short, barely 10 minutes, ending at the edge of a small bluff overlooking the water. The sky was gray, the sea a darker shade of it. We got out and stood by the railing, the wind tugging at my coat. "Come away with me," he said suddenly. I turned. "What?" "Just for a few days. Somewhere quiet, a beach, a cabin, anywhere. No pretending, no planning, just us." It should have sounded absurd, selfish, impossible. But in that moment, it felt like the first honest suggestion anyone had made to me in years. I searched his face, looking for cruelty, for manipulation. But there was none. Just a man. Tired, wanting, offering something dangerous and deeply human. "I can't," I said. He nodded, but there was something behind his eyes. Not disappointment. Acceptance. "Not now," I added. He laughed, dry and short. "There's always a not now." I walked to the edge, looking out over the sea. It didn't sparkle. It didn't invite. It just was. Vast, honest, cold. "I don't want this to be a hiding place," I said. "I want to stop splitting myself in two." He came up beside me. "Then choose, not for him, for you." And that was the heart of it. Not the betrayal, not the guilt, but the choice. I could no longer blame loneliness or circumstance or timing. I had let this grow, watered it with silence, and now it demanded light. We didn't kiss, not in that moment. But his hand found mine again as we stood there, and this time I didn't pull away. When I got home, the house felt strange, too symmetrical, too quiet. My husband was in the kitchen chopping vegetables, his back turned to the door. Music played from the small radio on the windowsill, some jazz station he liked. He turned and smiled. "Hey, you were gone a while." I kissed his cheek. "Ran into someone. We walked a little. He nodded. Dinner'll be ready soon. I stood there watching him move, the way he stirred the pot, the way he hummed along with the song. I had loved him once. I still did, in a way. But now I was standing on the edge of a life I didn't know how to live anymore. I sat at the table, folded my hands, and looked at him across the room. And for the first time in years, I realized I might soon have to break everything in order to find out who I really was. I didn't sleep that night. Not from restlessness or guilt, but from a kind of silent clarity that settled in me like a weight. It was the first time I allowed myself to sit with the thought without pushing it away. My marriage wasn't broken, but I was no longer part of it. I had been moving within its walls like a ghost, performing every act of love with the skill of routine, but none of the presence. And yet I didn't feel hate toward my husband. That would have made it easier. There was tenderness still, familiarity, a shared history held together by 1,000 quiet decisions. But love, the kind that compels you to reach out in the dark, not out of habit, but out of want, had faded like a photograph left in the sun too long. I got up before the alarm, moving quietly through the house. I brewed coffee, toasted a bagel I didn't eat, and stared out the kitchen window at the neighbor's garden, where nothing had grown since October. The silence in the house felt different now. Not lonely, not hostile, just exposed. When my husband came down, he looked surprised to find me dressed. "Early start?" he asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. I couldn't sleep. He nodded and poured himself coffee. We spoke little. I asked about his day. He asked about errands. There was no suspicion in his tone, only the soft distance that had grown between us like a slow root system, too deep to notice until it cracked the foundation. After he left, I found myself drawn to my desk. I hadn't written anything in months. Not emails, not notes, not even lists. But now I opened a blank document and stared at the blinking cursor, unsure whether I was about to confess or explain, even to myself. Instead of writing, I began to type a letter to him. My husband. But it wasn't a confession of betrayal. It was a confession of absence. I wrote about the years I spent folding myself into someone agreeable, someone digestible. I wrote about the longing I couldn't name for so long. Not for passion, but for recognition. For someone to look at me and see more than who I was to them. I wrote about the distance, about the silences between us that used to be comfortable but had turned hollow. I wrote that I didn't blame him, that maybe he hadn't changed, but I had. Quietly, slowly, completely. The letter was long, pages, not angry, not dramatic, just honest. And then I deleted it, because I knew it wasn't time. Not yet. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing in the closet, running my fingers along hangers. It wasn't an act of vanity or seduction. It was ritual. I chose a deep emerald blouse, soft to the touch, and a black skirt that fell just below the knee. I wore stockings I hadn't touched in years, and perfume. That same quiet one I'd chosen the night I opened the door to him. I didn't check my phone. He hadn't written, but I knew we would see each other. He had a habit of appearing when I needed him most. And sure enough, just after dusk, my phone buzzed. No words, just an address. A small cafe tucked between residential streets on the edge of town. One we had both once joked about. Too empty to be charming, too old to be trendy. I went. He was already there when I arrived, seated by the window, a black coffee in front of him. He looked up when I entered and stood as I approached. There was no smile, only a silent understanding. We didn't kiss. We didn't touch. "Why here?" I asked, settling across from him. He looked out the window for a moment. "Because it's the kind of place no one notices, and I wanted to talk." I nodded. "Then talk." "I don't want to be the thing that ruins your life," he said. "You're not," I replied, quickly, firmly. He raised his eyes to mine. "Then what am I?" I searched for the right words. "You're the person who reminded me I still have a life, and that's different." He took a breath, the kind that comes before something hard. I don't want to meet in shadows anymore. Not like this. Not because we're afraid of being seen. I didn't answer. I think I could love you, he said quietly. But not like this. The cafe was nearly empty. A man in the corner read a newspaper. A woman stirred her tea absent-mindedly. No one looked at us. No one cared. I'm not ready, I said. I don't even know what ready would feel like. He nodded. But you're not saying no. No. Then come with me. Not forever. Just for a few days. Just to step outside of the life where everything is already decided. I looked at him, and I saw it. Not just desire, but something terrifyingly rare. Patience. I can't give you promises, I said. I'm not asking for any, he replied. The next day, we left. No lies, no dramatics. I told my husband I needed to get away for a few days, that I felt suffocated, that I wasn't sleeping. He asked if everything was okay. I said I didn't know. He didn't press. He offered me a ride to the station. I declined. When we arrived at the cabin, it was late. The lake was still, frozen at the edges. The fireplace crackled softly. I took off my coat, stepped out of my shoes, and stood in the middle of the wooden room, breathing in the silence. He came up behind me but didn't touch. We slept in the same bed that night. Fully clothed, facing opposite directions. Not because we didn't want to, but because we needed to know what it was like to be still together. The kind of intimacy that isn't made of heat, but of recognition. That's what I had been missing. And in that moment, as I drifted into the first peaceful sleep I'd had in months, I understood something deeper than desire. He hadn't come into my life to tear it apart. He'd come to show me how much of it I had already abandoned. I remember waking up before him, just as the first threads of pale light began to push through the wooden blinds. The cabin was wrapped in quiet. Not the kind that felt hollow, but the kind that asked you to stay still, to listen. He was breathing evenly beside me, one hand half curled near his chest, the other resting lightly on the blanket between us. His presence was warm, anchoring, but not possessive. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the distant cracking of the lake ice outside. The bed was narrow, but I didn't feel crowded. I felt like I was sharing space for the first time in years, not simply occupying it. When he woke, we didn't speak at first. He rolled onto his side, eyes still hazy with sleep, and looked at me like I was someone he'd been searching for in dreams. His hand found mine under the blanket. Our fingers interlaced easily. I closed my eyes and let myself feel it. Not just his skin, not just the warmth, but the gravity of it. We spent the day without structure. No plans, no performance. We cooked breakfast slowly, sipping coffee from chipped mugs. He asked about the books I used to love, and I told him about the ones I'd hidden in drawers after marriage because they felt indulgent. I asked him what he was afraid of, and he said, losing things I never let myself have. In the afternoon, we walked along the frozen edge of the lake, our boots crunching softly against snow that hadn't yet turned to ice. He told me stories from his 20s, the jobs he left too soon, the women he let go because he thought he wasn't ready. I listened, not to what he said, but to how he said it. Like a man used to carrying things quietly. Like someone who had made peace with loneliness until I showed up and reminded him it wasn't a virtue. That evening we sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, sharing the last of the wine. His arm was around my shoulders, my head resting against his chest. The flames painted golden patterns on the floor, dancing and fading. And for the first time, I felt the ache of something too big to name. I can't go back and pretend nothing changed, I whispered. I wouldn't want you to, he said. But I also can't walk away from a life that's been built piece by piece over decades. Not like it's just something I tried on. I know. He didn't argue. Didn't try to convince me. He just kissed the top of my head and held me a little tighter. I don't remember falling asleep. Only waking up again in the middle of the night. The fire now dim. His breathing soft behind me. I slipped out of bed carefully, wrapped myself in a sweater, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold and sharp. The lake stretched out before me in silvery stillness. Everything looked frozen in time, but I wasn't. I was moving. Inside, something had already turned. I stood there for a long time, watching the horizon shift from night to the first pale blush of morning. By the time the sun rose, I knew I couldn't stay. Not here. Not forever. He understood before I spoke. When I came back inside, he was sitting at the edge of the bed, lacing his boots. He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw no surprise, only quiet resignation. I was never going to be the destination, was I? He said. I shook my head. But you were the road. He smiled faintly, and in that smile I saw grief and grace. I packed slowly. He didn't rush me. We folded the blankets, washed the mugs, closed the door behind us as if sealing something precious inside. The drive back was silent, but not heavy. We didn't hold hands. We didn't need to. We both understood what we'd been to each other. A moment, yes, but a necessary one. A mirror, a question, an answer. He dropped me off 2 streets away from home. I didn't ask him to. He just knew. Before I stepped out, he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small envelope. I wrote something. For after. When it's quieter. I took it without opening it. He didn't kiss me goodbye. He didn't ask me to stay. I walked the rest of the way alone. The house looked the same, but the woman who stepped inside it wasn't. My husband was in the kitchen, pouring coffee, dressed for a Sunday jog. He looked up, surprised. You're back early. I missed home, I said. He smiled, but his eyes searched my face too long. I kissed his cheek and went upstairs, closing the door softly behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope still in my hand. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Handwritten. No poetry. No declarations. Just this. You don't owe anyone your silence. You owe yourself your truth. I folded it and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Later that night, my husband asked if I wanted to go away together. A weekend. Just us. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere we hadn't been. I looked at him and saw something unfamiliar. Effort. Hope, maybe. A flicker of the man I'd once trusted with all my stories. Okay, I said. But I knew it wasn't the beginning of a return. It was the beginning of a conversation I could no longer avoid. Because I had already crossed a line inside myself, and there was no going back. Not to before. Not to pretending. Not to silence. And even if it took time, even if it meant breaking what looked whole, I knew I would speak. Because once you've been seen, truly seen, you can never go back to being invisible.